This is a production of Cornell University.
Hello, and welcome to Common Diseases in the Garden. So, I just picked up about a dirty dozen or so of diseases that you're likely to find if you work on the grow line or in your own garden. And they represent an array of diseases where some you see the signs of the disease and some you see the symptoms of the disease. And so let's just run through them very quickly. You're certainly not expected to memorize them, but just to have a feeling for the diversity of diseases that you'll find in the landscape. The first disease I wanted to go over was powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is one of the easier diseases to identify because there's a whitish fuzz, which is actually part of the fungi that covers the leaves, usually on the top of the leaves. And it's actually a group of fungi. It's not just one specific one, but they all have specific host ranges. So there are ones that hit lilacs, zinnias, dogwoods, roses. They're all susceptible to powdery mildew, and if we have a cool spring and summer, you're almost assured of seeing this disease. So the fungal hyphae infect the outermost leaves and then insert essentially their mouth part, as it were, although they don't have a mouth, but the feeding part, into the cells, and they feed off of the photosynthates that the plant makes. As I mentioned, the disease is much more prevalent when there's periods of high humidity and rainfall. So in terms of a management issue, you want to keep the foliage as dry as possible. So certainly if you think that you have a plant that's likely to get powdery mildew, let's say like a bed of zinnias, try not to overhead water those plants. Try to water them so that the leaves don't get wet. Most of the time, powdery mildew is an aesthetic issue, not so much a plant health issue, but it can be quite bad looking. I have found that powdery mildew on dogwoods can go into the stems and cause sort of a physiological problem for dogwoods, but otherwise it's just unsightly. Okay, if you are a small home fruit grower, specifically apples, you're likely to be dealing with apple scab. It's certainly one of the main diseases that orchardists have to deal with, and it causes small spots on the leaves, no big deal, but it also causes spots on the apples. Now, as I recall from my Pathology 101 class with Dr. Sinclair, who literally wrote the book on diseases, it doesn't affect the taste of the apple at all. It's just a surface thing. But, of course, if you were looking to buy an apple that looked like that on the right, you wouldn't buy it. So it makes them unsellable. The fungus overwinters on leaves that have dropped to the ground and hang around and serve as the inoculum source for the next year's infection. And there's actually software that's written to help you time, if you're a professional orchardist, when you have to spray your plants to prevent apple scab. But for the home orchardist, especially if you're starting an orchard, it's really great if you can select resistant varieties. It's going to help reduce the amount of management effort that you're going to have good apples. But if you have an apple tree already and you don't want to have apple scab, or you want to limit it, there are fungicides that you can use, and basically there's not a one-size-fits-all prescription for fungicide because it really depends on the weather, and then you might want to avail yourself of some of the Cornell apple scab software programs so that you know when to spray. So this could be because this is a major issue for apple growers. Going right from apples to strawberries, gray mold, Botrytis, is like powdery mildew. There are many Botrytis fungi, but they all are characterized by having this sort of gray mold that easily comes off the plant. Like you can see in the picture on the right, there's there's two good strawberries, sort of one on top of each other, and then just to the right of it is a gray mold affected strawberry, and you can see the pattern of spores that have just sort of fallen off and landed on the leaf to reinfect another part of the plant. And Botrytis unfortunately affects a lot of different herbaceous plants, and like powdery mildew is favored in cool wet springs and cool summers. Of course, you'll find that that's true with all diseases. A hot, dry year might be tough for the plants from a water point of view, but it's much easier on them from a disease point of view, because a lot of diseases are spread by raindrops hitting the fungus, releasing the spores, and the spores move to a new part of the plant. So anytime we have a cool, wet spring and a cool and wet-ish summer, look to see a lot of diseases. And again, people manage Botrytis by trying to not do much overhead watering. Of course, Mother Nature is going to rain on the plants, but if you're watering on a regular basis, you'd want to water just the base of the plant, not the leaves. Tar spot. This is one of my favorite diseases because it's pretty hard to misdiagnose, and the good news is, even though this looks really horrible, it actually has pretty much no effect on the tree. It hits maples, and it hits the maples in the late part of the growing season, and that's why it really doesn't have that much effect. It gets going, and it can be, pretty amazingly throughout the plant, and these vibrant tar-like spots all over the leaves. And these are actually small. Sometimes they're the size of a quarter or larger. But because they hit the plant late in the growing season, there's really no management, and there's really no real effect on the tree overall. And that would be true for a lot of the diseases that hit late in the season. Yes, it makes the plant unsightly, but it really doesn't have a physiological effect on the plant. The diseases we worry about are the ones that hit in the spring, and so that they're compromising the plant throughout the growing season. Diseases that hit later in the year, that only hit, the tar spot hits, and about a month later the leaves are falling off anyway, it's not really a big problem. Another one of my favorite diseases is black knot. Black knot hits plums, prunes, and especially cherries. And it's this sort of charcoal-like swelling growth on the twigs. And the fungus infects the twigs and then starts this sort of charcoal-y growth. And it's really easy to see when the tree is out of leaf. It's actually harder to see if you've got a decent-looking cherry and it starts to get black knot. You might not see it until the winter when the leaves drop out. There are resistant varieties, so that would probably be a good idea to do if you know you have a lot of black knot in your area. I certainly have seen in New York a lot more black knot than I see in Washington, D.C. area. I don't know why, but we seem to have a lot of black knot up here. You can prune out the affected twigs in the winter, although it might behoove you to dip your pruners in some alcohol between cuts just to make sure you're not spreading it. It can be just an aesthetic issue, but if it gets really going on a plant, it can take it out, because essentially the growth girdles the twig, and eventually that twig dies. And so if there are enough black knot infections throughout a cherry or plum or a prune, it can kill it. So again, always when you're buying new plants, look for disease-resistant varieties, because diseases are hard to manage. I don't think that there's really management for black knot. At least I'm not aware of it, except for just cutting it out when you see it. Tomatoes. Tomatoes get a lot of diseases, and none of them are good, and one of them is devastating. So the three that I wanted to touch on are early blight, septoria leaf spot, and then late blight. Starting at the top right, that's septoria. At least in my experience, just about every tomato plant on the lower leaves starts to get septoria. And depending on how you manage the disease, like some people just go in there religiously and strip out the lower leaves when they start getting septoria to keep the infection to a minimum. Some people just say, oh well, not to worry, I'm going to get my tomatoes and that's it. So it's up to you to decide whether you want to manage it that way or if you want to spray fungicide to try to keep septoria to a minimum. But it seems to me that almost every tomato is going to get it. There are resistant varieties, but it seems like it's ubiquitous in tomatoes. Also somewhat ubiquitous is early blight, and early blight causes more of a necrosis, where septoria is spots. Early blight is more like marginal leaf necrosis and into necrosis of the leaves, and that can be pretty serious and really keep your tomato harvest much smaller than it would be without the early blight. But then there's the devastating late blight. And late blight can, ironically, come somewhat early in the season, but it tends to be a little bit later in the season, and it causes these blank, dark cankers on the stems and then hits the foliage, and it can wipe out the plant just 100% dead. So there's pretty much no tolerance for late blight. Where you can tolerate septoria and you can tolerate a little early blight, there's really no tolerance for late blight. And unless you are 100% vigilant in taking out and inspecting your plants on a regular basis and removing the one that starts to have late blight, once late blight gets going, it's going to wipe out your crop. So again, resistant varieties, there's a list on the Cornell vegetable website on what varieties that we think are late blight resistant, using fungicides to keep it at bay, but it certainly is a bad problem that comes and goes each year. Sometimes it's a really bad late blight season, sometimes it's not so bad. So because tomatoes are probably our most important vegetable crop in the home garden, it's important to know these diseases, and certainly we'll have workshops where we really take a look at this, because you want to see this up close and personal. Okay, so now let's talk about diseases where you see the symptoms but not the signs of the disease. Cold injury. A lot of times when people come in and they show me samples like on the two leftmost pictures, they're like, what disease is hitting my plants? Well, it was cold injury. So it's an abiotic disease, non-living. And it can be very hard to diagnose, partly because especially with evergreens, the damage isn't going to show up for a month or two, and so people, by the time it's 70 degrees, you forget how bad the winter was, or maybe not with this year, and they forget that that's these plants, especially the evergreen plants that were exposed all winter long, can get this kind of damage. And on the right is a picture of a tree, a thin bark tree, probably a maple, and they can get cold injury too, called frost cracks, where especially on the south side, where the bark would warm up in the winter on a cold but sunny day, and then perhaps the sun goes behind a cloud and it's back to the very, very cold temperatures, and the bark can't expand and contract that fast and can cause a frost crack. So cold injury is something it's subtle. You have to keep a kind of an eye on the weather and a memory in terms of what the cold was that winter, and especially if plants are susceptible to cold injury when it's not only cold but it's so frozen that the plants can't take up water, so they actually desiccate, and so you see more like a drying out damage. So that's cold injury. Salt damage. On a year, especially like the one we've just had, there's a lot of salt on the roads, and I love this picture on the top right. That's salt spray damage, where you can see the yews got hit directly with salt, and the salt actually desiccates the needles. Salt is saltier than inside the plant, and the plant tries to equilibrate the water potential, and so water is drawn out of the needles into the salt that are coating the needles and kill the plant needle outright. You can see some browning on the pine foliage on the bottom right. And then my personal favorite salt damage is on deciduous trees, which you wouldn't think would have a problem, but under heavy salt spray damage, the buds are killed, especially the terminal buds. They're repeatedly killed by the salt, and the plant keeps trying to shoot out new shoots to accommodate the loss of that terminal twig, and you get this what we call witch's broom. So with salt damage, you can get salt spray damage, and you can get where salt goes into the soil and makes the roots actually lose water, because the roots become less salty than the soil around it, and water is drawn out from the root into the soil. There's not a whole lot you can do for salt spray damage. If you know you're going to have salt damage to the roots, you can leach this excess salt through the soil profile. Salt is mobile in the soil, doesn't get bound up in the soil profile. So usually we don't have to worry about it too much, because usually a harsh winter is followed by a bunch of spring rains, and those rains flush the salt through the soil profile. But if you dumped a bag of de-icing salts on one of your favorite plants by mistake, you can obviously try to remove as much salt as possible and then flush it out in the spring with water. Just keep watering that plant in the early spring, and hopefully the soil salts will move through the soil profile and away from your roots. Blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is a tomato disease and sometimes pepper, where you get a lesion or sort of kind of a mushy black lesion on the one side of the tomato, on the end of the tomato. And this is actually a calcium uptake deficiency. So in this case, where most of the diseases for tomatoes are worse when it's wet, this is a disease that's worse when it's dry, because the tomato is rapidly expanding, that needs calcium as one of the main ingredients in cell walls. So as the plant is growing, if it doesn't get enough calcium, it has problems with the new growth, and it can't, especially if it's dry, it just can't get enough calcium up into the plant, and you start getting problems like blossom end rot. There are tolerant varieties, so you may want to do that. In somewhat rainy New York, we don't seem to have it so badly, but just be careful we are having a dry summer, to make sure your tomatoes are well irrigated. So that'll help keep calcium uptake going, so you won't have the blossom end rot. Finally, Verticillium wilt. Verticillium wilt affects some of our most beloved plants. It seems to be particularly harsh on Japanese maples and on redbuds, but it hits a number of plants, certainly all the maple species. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner there's some Japanese maples, and they're just really thinning out, looking unthrifty, not very good aesthetically. That's probably Verticillium wilt. And then in the bottom picture is a maple with some branch dieback, and that again is probably Verticillium wilt. It's a little bit hard to diagnose sometimes because it's sort of a fading back. Verticillium often hits one branch at a time, so that can be a clue. And if you snip that branch off and you peel away the bark, in the upper right corner you can see some brown streaking in the cambium. It is subtle. I found it to be quite subtle, but that is diagnostic for Verticillium, the brown streaking in the cambium. Not much you can do. There's really no spray for Verticillium. It's a soil-borne pathogen. It's difficult to manage. Couple of things you would want to do. You can remove the affected parts and hope that that contains it. I've found that basically you start just removing the plant on the installment plan where you take off one branch and next year take off another branch, next year take off another branch. Certainly if that tree dies, you would want to plant resistant species back into that site. Because it's soil-borne, it persists in the soil. You wouldn't want to put another maple, like you wouldn't want to replace the Japanese maple that died of Verticillium with another maple. You might want to put, there are a lot of plants that are resistant to Verticillium, so you'd want to use those rather than susceptible species. Okay, well that is a quick overview of some of the most common diseases that we see in central New York, and happy disease hunting.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.